Dr. Kepi will be here, and we hope to have some questions for him in the next few minutes. And with that, we're going to continue within this same hour with Lesa Kardash, who's here to speak about an adaptive approach to managing for grassland habitat. So we're going to continue on this theme. Lesa obtained her Bachelor and Master's of Science degrees in Wildlife Ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has served as a wildlife biologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for the past 13 years, most of which she has spent in Portage and Wood counties, managing grassland habitat as the property manager for the Paul J. Olson and the Buena Vista wildlife areas. So this is a perfect segue for her to speak today on adaptive management. So Lesa, you're up. Is that on the projector on? I'm going to need a techie. All right, where is someone under 30? Quick. We're going to go to the rescue. Becky, we need a password. Oh, okay. You got a minute. You haven't voted. Vote. You haven't put anything on the auction. Put something in. And if you want some more power, there's even some of that. While we're waiting, questions for Dr. Kepi?
I'll take them.
He'll take them. He'll take questions. Yes?
I was asked, what do I see for the future? Management, I think, is going to become almost everything. I think it'll soon show that research is not necessary for almost everything. I would suggest that for much of the ecological problems we have, research has been done. All the answers are in. We simply need society to make decisions in a particular way.
Thank you. Lesa? Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. You're probably pretty tired. I would imagine you've been up very early. I was up a lot last night too, but for other reasons, not counting chickens. I've got a 2-month-old at home, so I feel for you. So yes, Sharon mentioned I've been the property manager for the Paulson Wildlife Area as well as the Buena Vista Wildlife Area here for the last 13 years. And I'm a wildlife biologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So I've really gotten an opportunity to get to know these properties and call them home. And I live actually only about 1.5 miles or so from the Buena Vista. So I spend a lot of time out on the grasslands. This is not advancing. So just to give you a little bit of background here, I'm going to be talking about briefly some of the work that we're doing on the Paulus and Wildlife area, so you've got an idea of what we do. And this is not necessarily across the board what we do on all the different properties, but focusing primarily on the Paulus. For the DNR, we consider grassland habitat high priority, especially within this area. And so it's our main focus. It's most of what I do in my job is working on the grassland habitat. Most of my time and our funds are dedicated to these grassland properties. The grasslands obviously depend on disturbance in order to maintain the diversity and the productivity that they have. And disturbance can mean any number of things. We have many tools in our toolbox, so to speak, that we rely on for managing our grassland habitat, and that's constantly changing. We do need to be adaptive, and we're constantly learning about new techniques, new tools that we can use, and trying to work them in as we can and learn as we go. So we manage grasslands because it is obviously a very rare habitat type, but we also are looking at some of the species that depend on those grasslands. And because we are an agency that works for and with the public, we're looking at also providing public recreational opportunities for folks at all times on the habitat and the lands that we manage. So we're trying to do that balance of doing what's best for wildlife while also providing recreational opportunities for the public. So it's a little off the screen here, but just kind of giving you an idea of what we have here on the Paulus and Wildlife area and some of the management challenges that we have working with this property. What's unique about the property is that it is spread out across 2 different counties, Wood and Portage County, on a very number of townships and all sorts of parcels that range in size from anything from 20-acre parcels up to 350 acres in size. So that's a challenge for us because there's a lot of area to work in, and these properties that we manage are surrounded largely by private lands. What's also unique about the Paulus and Wildlife area that's different perhaps from the Buena Vista is that we have largely hydric soils. They're wet, and that is a challenge for us quite a bit of the year outside of the winter when the ground is frozen in order to do the management that we want to. So because of that, we do have to recognize that adaptation is necessary on this property. And we need to constantly be changing what we're doing even from one year to the next. As you can see, we've got snow on the ground and it's April. And that seems to be something maybe that might be occurring more often in the future since this is our 2nd year in the row for that. So we never really know what we're going to be dealing with. So prescribed burning. Dr. Kepi had mentioned how that's absolutely necessary for grasslands, but unfortunately it's not something that's a very good tool for us on the Paulus and Wildlife area. I wish it was. I love prescribed burning. I think it's a great tool for grassland management, and we use it on a lot of our grasslands, including the Mead, the Leola, and the Buena Vista wildlife areas where we have chickens, but not so much on the Paulus. Since I've been here, we've conducted 1 burn, and that was the 1st year I started. And it's not for lack of trying. We go out, we try to put in fire breaks and get the opportunity to go out there. Spring burning is just not something we can do. It's typically too wet. There's standing water. It's hard to get something lit when you're sloshing around in a foot of water. In the fall, oftentimes it's also too wet for us, but we're doing our best to see if we can try to incorporate it as we can in the fall, and we still are trying to see if that's an option at some point. Some tools that we do have, though, are an option even when it is wet. And this is something that we're pretty excited about because it's a new tool that we're learning about. We're trying to be cautious about it, but we feel that there's a lot of potential with it. And that's managed rotational grazing. In effect, it's just taking livestock and rotating them through paddocks, and we can change up a lot of different things within these paddocks to adapt to each property. So we can change the size of the paddocks, the time that the cattle spend in each one of those paddocks within a pasture, how many livestock that we put out, and even the season that we're using to graze them. And this gives us a lot of flexibility in order to work with each property and see what might work and what might not work for using livestock. Some of the goals that we have are to increase the forbs and the grass diversity that we have, to try to reduce invasive species. One example out in the Buena Vista, we found that you can teach livestock to eat spotted knapweed, believe it or not, by spraying molasses on them. So there's a lot of different things that we can consider. By having grazing, we can also reduce our dependency on using chemicals. And there's a lot of concerns, obviously, about using chemicals and the impacts on the plants and the animals that use those grasslands when we do use chemical. And then also reducing our use of mechanical, which is great for us because we don't have a lot of staff or money. If we can have the cows do the work for us, that's great. And it's a great partnership for us too. It allows us to work with local farmers within the communities where these habitats occur. And they can use their livestock and also benefit from having their livestock out there. So it's a win-win in a lot of ways, and it really helps to get us support from the local agricultural community. Some of the challenges that we have with grazing, with rotational grazing, not traditional grazing, there's a limited number of grazers that are interested in doing that. It requires a lot of work on behalf of the farmer because they're out there moving the livestock every day or two. And so it's very time intensive. And there's a lot of infrastructure that is required too, more than just simply putting up a perimeter fence. You have to have interior fences and be moving those constantly. There's a lot of times I mentioned, not just on the farmer, but on the DNR staff as well. But we believe that it's worth our while to explore this tool. There's a lot of options for us in doing this. On the Paul Olson, we started in 2015. We currently have 3 pastures totaling 200 acres. 2 of those pastures are organic operations. So something that's also very unique to get to be a part of. These folks don't use chemical, and then that's another reason then that we'll not be using chemical on those properties. We're looking to expand in the future. We do have another property that we'll probably be putting into grazing starting next year. Brush control, obviously, is another tool that we definitely are taking advantage of. Most of the time it's mechanical removal that we're using. Livestock do actually eat brush, as I did not mention previously, so we can use them too. Oftentimes we follow up our treatments of brush control with herbicide. Our goal primarily is to maintain an open landscape, to keep the grassland open and not be encroached by brush. We typically use forestry mulching equipment, like you can see here on the top. That's a private contractor's piece of equipment. And on the bottom we have a FECON, which is owned by the DNR. So we both contract out and do it ourselves to get the work done. It requires, on Paul Olson anyway, frozen ground conditions. As I mentioned, it's a wet property. You bring really heavy equipment out there any time of the year other than the winter, and we're going to sink it. So we have a small window in which to do it, because not only does the ground have to be frozen, there has to be a very minimal amount of snow. If there's too much snow, we also can't get out there. Some of the brush mulching projects that we have, just giving you some before and after photos. These machines, when they can get out there and get it done, can get it done fast. They're very impressive to watch. They can just drop down small aspen within minutes and mulch it down to sawdust. It works great for us. Then we can come in later and deal with the resprouts, and eventually with the goal of converting those properties into grassland. Herbicide application, we do try to minimize the amount that we use, and we primarily use spot treatments, so we're focusing our applications where it needs to be done, but we do need to rely on herbicide in some cases. We use it to control invasive species, whether that be woody brush or even the invasive herbaceous species we have, such as spotted knapweed or common tansy. Challenges with that, using chemical is a very expensive endeavor, and it does require a lot of time on our part to put out that chemical. There's also obviously negative impacts to wildlife and plant species when we're using the herbicide. Biocontrol is another adaptive way that we've used it on a small scale for the Paul Olson wildlife area. Dan O'Connell, who I don't know if he's still here, his son was involved with the Boy Scout troop that over the past couple of years has done us a great favor, and they have raised beetles that they've put out on a section of the Paul Olson wildlife area where there's purple loosestrife. And they have done that for, like I said, a number of years. The last year that we put the beetles out was in 2017. We've seen some progress. Obviously, when you're using insects, it's a slow progress, but it's also very beneficial for us because we're not using the chemical. We do require dedicated volunteers to do that, as that's not something that we typically have the time to do with DNR staff. Mowing, another tool in our toolbox. We use mowing for a lot of different reasons. Obviously for invasive species control, we'll go out there and we'll do the brush mulching, we'll mow some of the invasives that we have and follow it up with chemical applications. We use mowing to maintain our blooming grounds. If we go out there in the fall and mow them, it's a lot easier to see and count them come springtime. And it tends to be where you mow it, they'll stay. a lot of the times for us. So it helps us to get an idea of where the birds are likely to be come springtime. We will also do mowing for preparing a site for pasture fence installation as well. Challenges for that, obviously if it's too wet, we can't get out there and mow, so most of the mowing that we do is going to be later in the summer into the fall on the Paulson. Sharecropping we use to some extent. It's not as much of a tool that I use on the Paulson as the Buena Vista does, but some of the goals that we have with sharecropping is to deal with some species that are invasives. Sometimes we can go on there and have a rotation of crops, and that helps then for us to reset the clock and be able to get out there and then seed and start over again on a grassland parcel. We use sharecropping to convert less than high quality cover to more high quality habitat. Challenges again with wet conditions that limits the feasibility. It's amazing enough difficult to convince some of the farmers to bring out their tractors on properties where they know they're going to hit rocks or run into anthills and break their equipment. So even though farming might be something that would normally be benefit for us, sometimes farmers just are not interested in taking their equipment out onto our state lands, and I don't always blame them. Some examples where we do sharecropping, as I mentioned, is the rotations. We'll do interseeding of clover for pasture improvement. So that's something we'll oftentimes ask the farmers to consider doing for us. And for hay harvest. Sometimes we can tie that into agreements so that instead of us mowing the booming grounds, we can have farmers do it for us. They get the grass, and we get that open area for counting the birds the next spring. So wetland restoration, something you wouldn't really think about when you're thinking of grassland work, but as I said, again, Paulson is a wet property. Most of the property out there, by definition, would be considered wetland when you're looking at the hydric soils and the plant species that are present. We have a lot of sedges and reed canary grass. And because of that, there's opportunity to maintain an open habitat that chickens do use. I've seen them booming and standing water and using wetlands quite a bit throughout the year. So this is a benefit to us as well, and it gets us some additional funds that we don't normally would have access to perhaps on other grassland properties. So for example, we can use NACA grants or the DNR's waterfall stamp funding specifically for these projects, and then it is a benefit to a lot of grassland species. So the goal for some of our projects obviously is to restore that hydrology and create wetland habitat. We'll go out and we'll ID areas that have a history for hydrology and having wetlands, and go in and dig scrapes to create seasonal wetlands for wildlife. The scrape material then are used to build berms, which can then help us to hold water to create more permanent, smaller bodies of water on the property. Oftentimes then there's that disturbance we have, so we'll go in and do some cover crop seeding and put in some grass and flower species following that disturbance. We've got a lot of great results because of this, and it's great to see. I've been out on some of the sites like the one here on the bottom where you go out, and I think on one site I was walking through it one year and I flushed a chicken off of a nest at the same time that I also flushed a duck off of a nest on the same property. So a great thing to see. Another way that we've been very adaptive in trying to use our limited funds and staff are through the Adopt a Wildlife Area program. And this is a relatively new program. It's only been out for a couple of years now, so some folks may not have heard about it. You can adopt a wildlife area or a fishery property. And we have recently, in 2017, we had the UW-Stevens Point student chapter, the Wildlife Society, adopt the Buena Vista Wildlife Area. It's closer to them, they prefer that property, but we've used them to come out on the Paulson property too and assist us with some brush removal projects. As you can see here at the bottom of the slide, I've got some of the students that went out there and we offered them some chainsaw certification courses in exchange for doing some work for us on the property. So it's a lot of free labor with young staff, and then I don't have to swing around a chainsaw in my 40s, so that's great. I'm looking into the future of having a UW-Stevens Point group adopt the Paulson Wildlife Area so that I can have my own minions out there too. We're looking at perhaps a Society for Ecological Restoration to do that for us. It's a great partnership because these students are eager to learn. We get them out there on the property to learn how to do the habitat management that we're doing, and then they get that experience then in turn to get jobs to work for us later. tree plots is also something that I think it might have been done in historical, times prior to my starting with the agency, but we've re-upped it again in the last couple of years. There's a Pittman-Robertson project that was approved to initiate the planting of apple trees on wildlife areas throughout the state. And this is, we have several goals for this project. One is to provide food and habitat for wildlife species. Obviously, you've got, the folks that are going to be using it for hunting, but we're also looking at it as ways to provide food and habitat for other species as well. It provides opportunities for hunters to increase their success, and in turn making an impact on hunter satisfaction and recruitment, which is something that we're struggling to do here in Wisconsin. It also encourages partnerships, which is something we're always looking to have. More volunteers and organizations that we use to help us to plant those apple trees on the properties. So that's something we plan on doing here on the Paulson here in the future, either this year or next year. We've got 2 different sites identified for putting out some apple trees. One up in the town of Carson in Portage County, north of Town Hall Road, and then in the town of Siegel in Wood County, off of Swedish Road. We try to pick these sites that are near areas that have some timber so that the wildlife have escape cover, close to parking areas so we can encourage use by hunters and other folks, and accessible for ATVs for disabled hunters. So one thing that I did mention over and over again is the struggle that we have here with access challenges on the Paulson. And one way that we're trying to remedy that is looking at taking advantage of some of the Pittman-Robertson funds that we've come into in the last couple of years to purchase equipment that will help us. So we oftentimes struggle to have large tractors come out on the property, so we're looking to purchase a Kubota with tracks. It's been very beneficial on some of the wet properties like the Mead Wildlife area, and hopefully we can use that on the Paulson to then get out and be able to do some work where we otherwise would not be able to outside of the winter. So looking forward to that as well. Well, I try to wrap it up here as quick as possible, so if you guys have any questions about some of the work we're doing on Paulson, feel free to ask me now or even ask me later if we're behind.
Questions for Lisa? Dr. Kathy, go ahead, please.
You mostly talked about cattle. What other grazers have you tried?
What other
Grazers, like species?
Oh, species? Sure, yep. We at one point were in the works to having goats come out. We had an LTE that had started a goat herd of his own, and he ended up getting another job and moving, and we just didn't get it to fruition. But that was an opportunity that I was looking forward to trying. Goats don't do well though in standing water.
I was wondering.
Yep. So it would be limited to sites where we could already access with equipment, but that is something to consider on more of our drier sites, perhaps on other grassland properties. We did have goats at one point on the Buena Vista Wildlife area.
Are your farmers incentivized to take part in the grazing of their cattle or their cows?
Well, as I mentioned, it's a limited interest with rotational grazing. If we did traditional continuous grazing, where livestock were just put out into a large pasture and left for the season, we would get a lot more interest. And we do that on the Buena Vista Wildlife area. The problem with that is it doesn't give us the flexibility to manage the property. I could give a whole talk on rotational grazing and tell you the benefits to wildlife because, we're able to move the livestock through and we can limit the amount of trampling they're doing within a paddock. We can also have them where by the time they come back to the same paddock, it's more than 30 days, which would allow a bird to perhaps get a nest off successfully. These are a lot of different things that we can do with rotational grazing that you can't with continuous grazing, but it's very time consuming for the farmer. They either have to live close or they have to be willing to drive out every 2 to 3 days and physically move those internal fences to move their livestock.
You have on your map a fragmented distribution of your units. Ideally, if you had $1 million, lots of money, what would be the long-term objective, I guess?
If I had
What would you
unlimited
like to
money?
see,
Oh man.
I'm curious about the interchange of bird between the various properties and where you could go.
Sure.
Position.
We're never going to see a connection to the north population and the south population, even with unlimited funds. So the birds that are at the mead and the Paulson are just not going to be mixing with the birds that are down there here at the Buena Vista and the Loyola wildlife areas, even with unlimited funds. Honestly, I don't even think with unlimited funds we could purchase all the properties that we would need to. Private land is here to stay. Farming is just something we need to recognize. I would use the money for incentives for the agricultural community, obviously, would be my biggest incentive to get practices that are better for conservation and recognize the need for farmers to get assistance to do those kinds of programs, such as the Farm Bill programs that we have.
One other observation, as you go north toward Wausau, you see a lot of idle farmland. How beneficial has that been to the birds?
Well, we actually have more idle land up at the Paulson than we do at some of the other grassland properties, so that has been a benefit. There tends to be a lot more grazing and more haying that's done north of Rapids than what you're going to see down here to the south, where there's more center pivot irrigation systems and more intensive farming that's not as conducive to grassland habitat and species. So that definitely is a difference that we see, for sure.
Thank you. Will you please give a hand to both Dr. Kardash? We have two more speakers this afternoon, which I'm very excited about. We're going to introduce them in just a moment. I want to Bree, hold up your beautiful prairie chicken. This is the artist who made this beautiful crochet prairie chicken. She and others have things here on the table that have spent a lot of time and energy on. Some things don't have bids on, so I please encourage you to go out and, and bid yourself up, please. That it's just, I do hope that you will do that. And also, if you have not voted yet for a poster, I encourage you to do that and put your little Post-its in the little jar that's there on the table. There's still some cobbler and